GlideRecord Concepts and Best Practices. After meeting with some folks yesterday too, talking about this, something I already knew needed to be talked about, but it became even more apparent when I heard other people talking about it. And that's sort of like the quirks and weirdness behind GlideRecord. And, you know, we have a very varying degree of expertise on this share the wealth. So I'm going to be as basic as I possibly can be while also getting into some more advanced topics. So please, at any point, if anyone has any questions, stop me. I intend for these share the wealth to always be interactive. And I really, you know, if there's something that you disagree with, please let me know. Having that disagreement, you know, typically leads to better solutions and to better ideas. Some of this is opinionated, some of it is just factual, but it's not so opinionated I had to put a disclaimer like I did my last one. So that's a good thing. So anyway, we'll talk about sort of the quirks of GlideRecord, why it is the way that it is, why it acts the way that it acts. And it also covers some of the other, you know, general objects that you interact with in server code and ServiceNow as well, because they are similar to GlideRecord. Okay, let me just get a head count here real quick. 72, very nice. Okay. So let's go ahead and start. Agenda, made the agenda very, very simple. Definitions, so we're going to go over definitions of what GlideRecords are. Like I said, we're starting very basic, as well as some related terms with GlideRecord. We're going to go over some concepts, basic and advanced. This is going to go into sort of why, well, it goes into the quirkiness as well as the definition of, you know, what's happening behind the scenes with GlideRecord. And then we'll go into some best practices. It ended up being a lot less best practices, you know, on paper at least, than I thought it was going to be, but they are important ones. So I want to make sure we go over all of those. And I have demo in here, but the demo is really going to be, like I said, going as we go through this process, rather than, you know, going through verbiage and all that. And then, you know, at the end, getting to demo, we're going to probably going back and forth to code along the way. Okay. I will be opening up my Visual Studio here just for a little bit of code that I already wrote for this. It's not much, it's minimal. Okay. All right, cool. So definitions. Let's start with GlideRecord. GlideRecord, very simply, is a server-side object that contains one or more records from a single table, right? So we as developers create GlideRecords. We supply them with queries so that they know what information to go get from the database. And then we act upon those GlideRecords, typically by iterating the GlideRecord and either setting values and updating the database, or getting values from the database so that we can use them in our code or display them to the user. So in a nutshell, that's what a GlideRecord is. GlideRecord object, right? This is the object that we act upon. The GlideRecord API is different, right? So GlideRecord API is all of the programming behind that object, right? And that is our primary means of interfacing with the database from ServiceNow server-side code, right? There is a client-side GlideRecord. It's not recommended to be used, but if you try to use GlideRecord in client, it actually works. It should always be used asynchronously if you are going to use it, but it really shouldn't be used, right? We could go into more client stuff when we get into Glide Ajax in a different share the wealth. All right, so I wanted to bring up GlideRecord Secure here as well. So GlideRecord, if you, as a developer, go out and put a GlideRecord call out in a server script somewhere, it's going to run that script and not check ACLs by default, right? That's what a GlideRecord does. If you want it to enforce and check ACL so that it fails, if the user running the script, or the user that initiated the script, so the user that performed the action that initiates the script does not have access to it, then you would want to use GlideRecord Secure so that ACLs will actually get evaluated, and, you know, updates to the table, updates to the database are either prevented or allowed. Okay. So 3 different things here, 3 different little concepts. Again, GlideRecord is what we interact with. The API is what is the code. And it's kind of strange too. When you look at the documentation of GlideRecord, it's, you know, it's a lot for one object, for one class. They've put, you know, there's a ton of methods in there for getting data from the database. And then there's a ton of methods in there for pulling data, like actually acting upon it. It's a lot for one object, but it is the primary API that we use in development in ServiceNow. Okay, let's get into concepts, right? This is sort of a pretext as to why GlideRecords are weird. GlideRecord is, so it's pulled from the server by ServiceNow, and it is not actually a native JavaScript object. It is a Java object, okay? So behind the scenes, ServiceNow is using Java to interact with their database, which is, if you don't know Java or anything about Java, Java is a server-side language, completely different from JavaScript. The names are similar, but it's a completely different thing, right? It's only for server-side. So Java objects can be brought into JavaScript, and they behave kind of like objects in JavaScript, but not 100% like objects in JavaScript. There's some weirdness to them, right? So that's why I'm bringing this up here. A lot of your methods, a lot of your classes in ServiceNow, glide date time being one that's a prime example, also a Java object, but a lot of your classes in the ServiceNow API, you'll call functions on them and they'll actually set internal properties rather than returning some value. I want to say add or subtract, one of those two with the glide record with the glide date time is like that. And so basically you have to call the function on it, but you're not setting a variable with that value that's coming out of that function because it doesn't return anything. And that can be massively confusing to some people, who, especially whenever you're in JavaScript. I'm going to turn my heater off real quick, sorry. Especially when you're in JavaScript and you're so used to, returning values, because it's really best practice in any function to return values, even if it's a null value. So anyway, you have these void classes or void functions that get called in Java that set some sort of internal property on that object. And then you have to use another function to get that property, right? To get that property value. So one of those, going back to glide date time, if I can't remember what function again, it's add or subtract. One of those, internally it does the calculation, sets the properties of that object, and then you can use, get display value to actually fetch what that value is. I may be completely wrong on what those functions are, but anyone who's dealt with glide date time probably already knows that it's wonky, right? Okay, cool. So one thing about Java 2 in a lot of cases here is that these internal class properties that you're setting on these Java objects hold references rather than values. If you've ever developed in Java or C#, I remember specifically in old Visual Basic, being able to set parameters as either by value or by reference. And all that it means is that it's either going to be a pointer that's pointing to some reference in the code or in memory, or it's going to be an actual value, right? References change based on perspective and values do not. So one of the huge mysteries around GlideRecord, and what I see a lot of, one of the things that prompted this share the record or share the wealth is people calling toString on things. Well, the only time you have to call toString on something coming out of a GlideRecord is when it's pointing to one of those internal properties that is a reference rather than a value. And that's why you have to call toString on it, okay? You can iterate through, and I'll show you in some code in just a moment. You can iterate through 10 GlideRecord items, GlideRecord iterations, and every time you go through it, the reference changes to the current GlideRecord object. And so if you were to go in and just start pushing GlideRecord object fields to an array without calling toString on them, all of them are going to be the same because you're actually pushing a reference each time. And then on the last one, the reference is the last record. And so that's what it appears to be in the array, okay? I'll just show you that real quick. Let's say, I hope I have this big enough to, let's say var gr equals new GlideRecord. And we're just going to do gr SetLimit. So SetLimit allows us to say, I'd only like to return back a number of records. So I'll do 10 gr query. So this is just going to return the top 10 incidents here. Okay. So right now I'll create an array. Let's say numbers, and it's an empty array. While gr next. So this is, I'll get into all of these things in a little bit, but this is the iterator. This is how you iterate a GlideRecord. And I'll explain the iteration or why you have to iterate a GlideRecord as well. Let's push the number of each incident to this array. Oops, gr.number, right? So gr being the GlideRecord, .number being the field name that we're walking to using our dot notation. So we're pushing numbers into numbers, and now we're going to do gsinfo numbers. Actually, no, we're going to do, I'll go ahead and do numbers for each, and we'll print each one. That's going to make it look better. So gsinfo number. So now let's run this, and what we should see, like I said, since these are references within GlideRecord, we should see the same value 10 times. And that's what we see. All right. We see that same value 10 times because, again, we've pushed the reference into the array 10 times. We haven't pushed the value into the array 10 times. So what do we do to remedy this? Is we just come in here and say to string. Oh, not here, I'm sorry. We can call to string here on number, or we could actually use GetValue, which is preferred, right? Because GetValue always returns a string value. Now we do it and we should see our proper top 10 numbers. And there we go, right? So they're no longer a reference now. Now each one of them is an actual value. And this is why, I mean, I see it all the time, not internally as much, but some in the community where it's just like, oh, just throw it to string on it. But there's a very specific time and place where calling to string or calling GetValue is valid and usable in any way, or actually is going to help you. And this is it. So anytime you need to change a reference that is a Java object, something that you need to display to the user, this is how you do it. Now, another quirk here would be this. If I were to just knock out this whole array and not do the array at all, but then just do a print or GSInfo on GR number, anyone want to guess what's going to happen? And yeah, Jason, you bring up a good point. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead and we'll talk about what Jason said.
You'll get different numbers.
Yes, and that is because GSInfo forces this to a string, right? It's not because we've changed anything. It's still a reference when it hits GSInfo, but GSInfo is actually grabbing the value and saying, let's print that value out. Right? So we hit it, and now we see, but still not great practice to use that, to use gr.any field name like this, because there are places where it's not going to work that way. And ease of reading the code and ease of use for everyone downstream that's going to be maintaining your code is just to use the methods that ServiceNow has provided you with GetValue and GetDisplayValue. And yet, so there's a question here in chat from Jason that instead of using .toString, because here we could use toString. Actually, let's go back to the push numbers, push, and GR number. Right now, what we showed before is that these come out as references. Now, GSInfo here it does actually turn them to strings, but the problem is GSInfo is not running until they're all set to the same reference, right? So they do come out as strings whenever you print them this way, but if you push them into the array first, then the array is holding those references rather than values. So here we could have used toString to get this to work and gotten different values instead of the GetValue. Or as Jason brings up, you can use plus empty string to force it to be a string. So I find this to be less concise, less clear, especially if you have a long string that has a bunch of these, or a concatenation of strings that has a bunch of these. So I prefer to string if I'm going to use to string, and if I'm working on a glide record, I prefer GetValue. Okay, I think toString in the grand scheme of things is slightly less performant than this, but it's so negligible that it's not going to matter. Right? We're not doing big data here or anything like that. Okay, so that demonstrates what I'm talking about here with references and why it can be very, very quirky. Okay, so we went over references rather than values. And then again, references must be converted to values if they're being stored. So again, if we're going to put those into an array or anything like that, then we need to make sure we are converting them to values, preferably again with GetValue or GetDisplayValue on the actual glide record call itself. Any questions so far that I can audibly answer? Hey, good point, Chris, about undefined not having it to string. So you have to kind of, be sure before you call to string on something that it's not undefined or null, right? So yeah, I would typically check to make sure GR number is not undefined or null before I call to string on it, just for good practice. But again, I still think to string in the long run is more concise and more descriptive as to what it's actually doing. Easier to read, easier to maintain overall if you're going to use to string. Okay. All right. Next, okay, some more oddities, and these are, I think, more odd than what we were just talking about. Okay, so I see the use of GlideRecord.get, so I want to make sure we're all clear with what that does versus GlideRecord.query. Okay, so glide records are strange in the sense that they can represent two different things. They can represent, well, three things really. They can represent an empty glide record that's just an object that has had no actions put upon it yet. So it has not queried anything yet, and it's just an object. Or it can be a single object, right? Or it can be a collection of objects. So if you call some, let's use get as an example. Here we see using the get function retrieves a single record, but that's not always true. And that's the quirkiness we need to talk about. So right after that, I tell you how to pull multiple records is to use get or to use query. So get sometimes retrieves multiple records, right? So the documentation for get tells us that the get function, if you pass in a sysid, and if the system recognizes it as a sysid, it's going to go out and get that one record. Okay, what I found through working with get, I typically don't use it any way other than just to pass a sysid. If I have a query, I'll use query because again, it's more concise. But you can use get and pass in two parameters rather than one. You can pass in a field name and a value. And if that results in a single record being returned, it returns a single object. If it results in two, it returns an iterable object, which can be really dangerous and have lots of side effects that you're not expecting if you're not 110% sure of what you're returning, right? So I can demonstrate this real quick. We'll use get here. So we'll still stick with GR, but we're going to get rid of our GR. I mean, with incident, I'm sorry, but we'll get rid of our GR query. We'll get rid of our set limit here. Okay. So I'm going to jump over here to incidents and let's look at open incidents. And I'm just going to go into a record and grab a sysid. Okay. Copy that sysid, come over here, and I'm going to say gr get. I'm going to pass the sysid. And then I'm going to just do a GS info on gr.next. So gr.next is what we use to iterate through a glide record that has a collection within it, but it also will give us a true or false if it can iterate to the next one, right? So what I would expect to happen here, since this is a single object and not a collection of objects, is that gr next is going to return false. Okay, and it does. So it does not actually iterate to a new object. It stays on the one object that got returned. Now, if we make this a little bit different and say short description, and I'm going to go do this real quick where we go back to our incidents. And I'm actually going to group by short description real quick, just so I can see if there are any that have multiple of the same. And there are because I looked at it earlier. But let's look at this one first. Let's grab. So we know that there's only one incident with this short description. So again, based on what I've already told you, I would expect this short description being passed into the get function to return a single record. So let's try that. Get short description. Here's the single record. Again, gr next should be false because it is a single object, not a collection of objects. And it is. Okay. Now, if we come down here and grab this one, EMR system is down, we can see that we have two records here. I'm having a hard time in this new UI, which I love, by the way. I'm getting used to it. So the EMR system is down. We know we have two incidents with that short description. So if I come in here and use that, well, now I have an object that has to be iterated, right? So let me actually do this. Let me go grab that top short description again, assessment ATF assessor, and I'm going to comment out some code real quick. So we'll add gr get again, short description, and put in the old value. And let me get rid of this. So again, this returns just a single record. And so with that, I can say gr get value. Let's look at the value of number, right? And we're going to print out the value of number. Oh, maybe not. Hold on. Was this the one that only returned one? Maybe get value is a problem. Let me see if number just works. No. Okay. Sorry. I may have thrown you all off on that one. So this returns one. but not with a next. So it actually is a little bit different than I thought it was going to be. Let me check this real quick. So if I get rid of this and do GR next, and we know we have a next in here, let's call, so we can move to the first record, right? We know we have a collection coming back from this. Frozen up. Okay, we know we have a collection coming back from this, so we can move to the first record, and then we can call gr.number. We should get the number, there it is, of that incident. So I thought get, if you pass in a value that was unique, it was going to send you one that was just an object, but it looks like it doesn't. It looks like it actually fails, which is actually a good thing. I think that's better than it returning just a single object. Going back though to sysid, pulling by sysid, and copy the sysid again. This is how I recommend using get if you're going to use get, right? Is just get it with a sysid. That way you always know you're going to have 1 or 0 objects returned. It's either going to come back and it's going to be null because it couldn't find anything, or it's going to actually grab the record that you want it to grab. Okay. Now, it's also best practice here that when you call to check to make sure the get function actually returns something. And it's really convenient here that get returns a Boolean value if it can grab the record. So it's best practice to do an if statement and put your get in the if statement. Then within your if statement, say gsinfo.grNumber. I'll use GetValue here actually. Okay. Else gsinfo, not found or something like that. Okay, it's going to be, but I just want to show that that's how you can do error, how you can check here to make sure your glide record is actually returning something that you can act upon by doing the if get. Okay, so when we run this, we should get our incident number again. Okay, so calling get also, again, going back to the whole statement here of JavaScript does not always return a value. Sometimes it's void. Let's say we want to say, I'm assuming here that var record, I could just get it by calling grget with that sysid, right? And then let's do a gsinfo on record and get rid of all this code and hit script here. So it returns true. It doesn't return the record at all, right? Because again, get only returns a true false value. It does not return the operation that you might think get would return in most other cases. Because again, it's only updating internally the record that is associated with the glide record. It's not actually returning the record itself. It's just returning true or false. Okay. So little quirks there with how get works. Again, my recommendation on this is use get when you have a sysid. It can be used for other things, but it can also get really hairy if you start passing in, something that could return multiple records. Now you could make the general statement that, okay, well, I'll use get, but I'll always iterate, right? Well, the one time you forget that and you pass in a sysid, you can't iterate because it's again one object rather than a collection of objects, right? If I tried to call gr next on this to move to the next record, I get a false because there is no next record. So for safety and for your own sanity in troubleshooting, if you're going to use get, use it with the sysid. Use query for everything else. Okay. Any arguments against that?
David, is there any downside to just always using query?
If you're always going to iterate, I'd say it's less concise, right? If I know I'm passing in a sysid, it's much easier for me to call. Let's just look at what those look like, right? If gr get, let's say this is a function, gr. Okay, let's make this a function actually. Function get glide record, or get incident actually, because we already have incident in there. Sysid. Okay. So here's one of our functions. Sysid now becomes this sysid. I keep locking up. I'm sorry. I don't know if it's the instance or if it's the fact that I'm on Zoom. All right. So we have a function now, GetIncident. Let's do another one for function GetIncident. And also pass in sysid. And this time we'll use query. So we're going to do gr add query. And we're going to add sysid equals sysid coming in and gr query. Now, after that, we have to say if gr has next, because it's an iterated thing at this point, then return gr. We don't have to do it that way. That's how I prefer to do it. Okay, because then I know it's going to be, I can come down here and now return null else. So if I get a null value, I know it's because my glide record was invalid, or it could not get a glide record based on what I passed in. So this versus this, in my opinion, the more lines of code you have, likely, well, in some cases, the more open you are for errors.
Add query, would you still want to use SetLimit as well, or no? If it's just returning the sysid?
You absolutely can do that. Yes, if you know you're passing in a sysid, then I would do that as well. So if you set limit to 1, knowing you're going to return 1, it's still going to return an iterated value, though, an iterated object. So you're still going to have to do the while. You know, once you pull this incident out, you're still going to have to do a while on that and iterate into the first glide record, even if you do a set limit of 1. So I think easier to work with. Once I call this top one, so var incident equals get, and I know this is a bit confusing having 2 functions the same name, but if we pass in that same sysid, oops, I'm going to actually call this get incidents since we're doing an iteration on it. So incident, get incident here, I can just say if incidents, right? If it comes back and it's not null or undefined, then gsinfo, can't type when I'm on camera, incident number. Okay, now get incidents, we can come down here and call that as well. Let's say var incidents equals get incidents, passing in the same sysid. Again, we have to say if incidents, because remember it's going to return null if it doesn't find anything. But now I have to call while on it too, while next, or while incidents next. GSInfo incidents. I can't just call number. Well, I can't just call number. That'd be fine. So we should get the same results in both of these, but now, you know, we're talking about 5 lines of code or 4 lines of code versus this 6, right? And they should both come to the same thing, and they do. So it's just a little more concise using get when you have a sysid that you're passing in. So anything that you get by sysid, again, it's just my recommendation to use that, because it's, you know, it ends up being less code, less issues, and easier to read, in my opinion. So that's the first set of oddities. Let's go to another set of oddities, right? Again, this is just sort of explaining what we just went over, right? The get function retrieves a single record when the argument is passed in as a result, and the result is a single record. Again, this is really my first time messing with get in a way that I could try and return multiple records. And so what I was testing with earlier, it looked like it was returning multiple records, but in fact, it looks like it's actually erroring out. So that's actually not a correct statement here in the presentation. So I'll make sure I change that. So here it should be, it retrieves nothing if the argument is passed in, result in multiple records. And then query function always returns or retrieves multiple records. So if you know you're going to have multiple records, or there's a chance of having anywhere from 1 to many, the recommendation is to use query as we did down here. Okay. And again, with query, you have to actually add the queries that you're going to be, the terms that you're going to be querying in the database. It's not just get, it's actually adding all the terms. So if we were getting anything other than sysid here, let's say we were getting things with 5 different terms, and this script becomes a lot longer again. And then iteration. So we've already gone over some of this in the code, but this is how you iterate GlideRecord. The reason we iterate a GlideRecord with next is because next returns a true false value. And so you can call a while statement, and as long as next is true, when we have the setup as we do here, where am I? Actually, let's do this a little bit different. Okay, I'm going to get rid of my functions here, and we're just going to go back to var gr equals new GlideRecord incident, and we're just going to do gr add query, add active query. So we're just going to get our active incidents, gr query, And so now we do the iteration, right? So we know this is returning more than one, a collection of records of incidents. So we call while on it. Again, the way while works is whatever you put in these parentheses is a Boolean value. And as long as it returns true, the while loop will continue to go. And it's just gonna go until it does not return true. Well, gr.next happens to return true if there's a next record, and it happens to return false if there's not a next record. So we utilize that rather than doing any other sort of iteration method like you would a typical object in JavaScript or an array. We use this method here because we leverage that true false value of next. Okay, and again, we can do gsinfo, gr number, and get all of our active incidents that way, right? Okay, so that's really what I'm touching up on here, is that the reason we use while and not some other iteration method is because this is a Java object. You can't call for each on it because it's not an array. You can do this. So if we were to do, instead of a while, let's say we try and iterate it like we iterate an object in JavaScript, right? So for var field, record in gr, right? So we know GlideRecord is a collection of records. It's not just one record. So I'm going to try and iterate all of them. Let's do a gsinfo gr. Okay, actually do gr record. Is that how I do it? For each record in gr. Yeah, no, I would just do record. Sorry. So let's see what happens if I just do record. What's that? So looks like we got a bunch of metadata, right? Which is something I was going to go into anyway, because ServiceNow has, I think, altered how, and again, all of this is black box. I can only assume how they do things. So if you tried to print a glide record into a string at like a JSON Stringify string, it returns sysmeta like that just did. So I think behind the scenes, ServiceNow takes this object when it moves it over into JavaScript and turns it into an actual object, but it's not the actual object that you would expect it to be. It's not, you know, an array of objects as you would expect it to be if it was pure JavaScript, I guess is what I'm saying, which is a good point. We could go back to that while gr next and do JSON or gsinfo and call JSON Stringify on it. So what JSON Stringify does is takes an object in JavaScript and it turns it into a JSON string. So if I just did a JSON Stringify on, let's just do if next, right? Because I only want to pull the first one. Let me do a set limit just to make sure. Okay, let's pull one, and then we're going to go to the first one using next, and we're going to call JSON Stringify on it. And it's interesting because what you get is this sysmeta object, which is completely different than if you were to say, you know, gsinfo, you know, look at some property, right? Like we have been doing with number. It's a completely different object if you stringify it than it is if you iterate it and actually call upon the different properties. I think ServiceNow probably did that so that you can pass a glide record in through Glide Ajax, like stringify it and send it to, you know, back to the client through Glide Ajax and not have a complete failure of whatever object it is that you expect, right? But again, a lot of this stuff I can only assume because I can't see exactly what GlideRecord's doing behind the scenes. I leave stuff like that up to Mike Barr. So if he's on the call. Let's see this. And the record returned all the column names from the table available on the objects as the keys. Yes, the values of those are another set. Yes, that's right. So you'd have to use actually record to get the values of each of those. Those were just the properties set from the glide record. But the sysmeta object doesn't follow that logic at all, right? Because sysmeta is its own object that's being returned whenever you do JSON Stringify. It's just weird. Okay. All right. So that's a little bit of the iteration of a glide record there. Yes, sysmeta is weird. It is. Okay, dangers. I wanted to make sure we bring this up, right? So encoded queries, rather than passing in each line of, for those that aren't very familiar with GlideRecord, if we wanted to pass in an encoded query, right? An encoded query is just a string that represents a query. So, okay, add encoded query and let's say active equals true. So it's a string query. And let's also say number like, and let's just start with the first number, INC 000, right? Oops, that's O. Okay, now we should get records that meet these criteria. So while GR next, GS info, GR number. So we only have one that's active that is in, let's do starts with.
SetLimit.
Oh, thank you. We could use starts with too. Yeah, and let's take the set limit off. There we go. Now we have the ones that start with Inc 000 and that are active. So that's what an encoded query is. So I bring it up because if at any point in this encoded query you put something that's in, rather than it failing, it's actually going to apply the part of the query that is valid, which if you're doing like a mass deletion or something like that, you may delete a bunch of records you didn't want to delete. So this one can be very, very dangerous. There's a system property to actually mitigate that, because I assume this got created after one of the early releases and people deleted a bunch of records. And this is glide invalid query returns no rows. By default, I do believe that is set to false. So it will return the rows if you do not set that to true. Okay. So setting that to true actually makes it to where if you have a failure at any point in your encoded query, it's going to return no rows. Okay. All right. So I've got best practices now. I wanted to show this piece here. This is part of best practices. Good. I'm glad I looked at that real quick. Oops. Excuse me there. Let's go back to presentation. All right. Best practices. All right. And again, some of these are opinionated, but I have arguments for all of them if we need to go into arguments. All right. Oh, then when you stack add query. So stacking add query is kind of strange, right? Because when you call add query and stack it, each add query is actually returning something that's not a glide record. It's returning a glide. What's the class called? Glide query. I can't remember exactly. Let's see. Glide query. I can't remember what it is. I could talk to you about it after Ben, but at glide query, that actually returns a different object than glide record when you stack add queries, and I find that can be confusing as well. But yeah, that's not an issue with adding the queries. I don't believe it's only an encoded query issue, as far as I understand, that it actually does that and returns all of those records. Okay. So best practices. I put in here first and foremost, do not nest GlideRecord calls. Almost every time I see an issue with GlideRecord, it's because we've got nested GlideRecord calls, right? So that's the code that I wrote in here, right? So here, single function, get request catalog items or item names. We have a GlideRecord for request. We then nest the GlideRecord call for requested item. And then we could even go further than that and pull things that are, use another GlideRecord call to pull things from that requested item that require GlideRecord lookups. Let's try and avoid that. It is always possible to avoid that. Let's say that. I'm not going to say if possible. Let's avoid that because it can get very, very confusing. And when you go to troubleshoot, it can be very, very difficult to pinpoint where the problem is. So a method that's much more concise and I think so more readable, I think more maintainable, I think more just easier to read overall is to break the two GlideRecord calls up into their own function, right? Get request ID by number and get requested items by request ID. And then you just call them up here and you don't have the nesting GlideRecords actually sitting within GlideRecords. Technically they are because you're calling functions within functions, but it's still a lot cleaner. So this does the same thing. Both of these return the same thing. Let's show that real quick. I've actually got a request number in here that I already know has certain variables. So yeah, they both return the same thing. One's easier to read. Why wouldn't you use it, right? So try to avoid nesting GlideRecord calls. Again, you can lose track of them very easily. I also say here, put every GlideRecord call in a function. And I think that's true. You should always put a GlideRecord call in a function. I hear a lot of debate about naming GlideRecord GR. If every one of your GlideRecord calls is in a function, it doesn't matter if you call it GR, right? Because it's scoped to that one function, and I'm not going to have another GR in there, another GlideRecord in there. It's one single GlideRecord call. So there's no harm, no foul in using GR, and I don't have to be creative with my names because this tells me what the function is doing, not this, right? Be very descriptive with this name. Doesn't really matter if you're descriptive with this name. If GR was not a standard or an industry standard name, I would 100% say don't use it. But it's a very, very standard name for developers in ServiceNow. When you see GR, you know exactly what it is. It's a GlideRecord, right? Okay. Always return a value from a function, even if the value is null. I mentioned that earlier, and this is more of a general development thing. So if you always return a value, even if that value is null, and you get an undefined, then you know an error occurred or something that you probably have to go in there and handle your error in some way that you may not have accounted for. If it returns null, then you know you probably went that path, to where it would return a null rather than an undefined value. Okay. Use get for single functions. So we talked about that earlier. When you're expecting to receive a single record, use get. Again, sysid, right? Use get with sysids. GetValue and GetDisplayValue. I think in readability, for readability's sake, these are preferred to string or the plus quote. There's an exception to that I'll get to in a moment. But if you're calling pulling a value directly from a glide record, this is the most concise way to do it. GetValue or GetDisplayValue. GetDisplayValue and GetValue are always going to be the same if you're not pulling a reference, right? It's a reference. It's only when you're pulling a reference that it goes out and gets that display value of that reference. So in most cases, you use GetValue instead of GetDisplayValue. Okay, SetValue and SetDisplayValue. I noticed today when looking through the documentation that SetDisplayValue is no longer documented, but I definitely use this quite often when I'm like trying to set the value of a group or something like that, where I don't want to go out and get the sysid. Might not be the best practice because I know behind the scenes it's looking up that sysid. So I'll probably take that out before we put this out for anybody to actually use. But SetValue definitely you want to use if at all possible. Okay. Okay. SetLimit function. So we saw that in a lot of our sample code here. Use SetLimit anytime you want to limit, what's coming from the database. Let's say you are deleting some records and you want to test that first. I would highly recommend doing a SetLimit on one record first, or even 5 records, to ensure what gets deleted is what you're trying to delete. And then, before you open the floodgates and say, I'm going to run this automated script that deletes a bunch of records. Okay. Avoid using get row count. This one's well documented and well talked about. And the reason we don't want to use get row count is because it's going to count all rows. If we have, a million records that come back from an incident table from a customer's instance, it's going to count a million records. Instead of that, use the hasNext function, which is instead of using next, you can actually call gr.hasNext, and it's going to return true if there's at least one record in its collection, and it's going to return false if there's not one record in its collection. So if you're trying to determine if it's iterable, hasNext is the way to go. If you do actually need the row count of what's being returned, then you use Glide Aggregate, which is not covered in this because that would be a whole nother presentation. Is Glide Aggregate actually counts row, or it's specific to counting or providing averages and maxes and things like that from tables rather than retrieving actual rows. So it's much more performant when you're doing counting of rows or records. Okay. Avoid dot walking to reference field values from a glide record when possible. We all do this, and I didn't realize what a performance hit it is until really considering this presentation, to be honest with you. When you dot walk, so if we go back in here and save our gr equals new glide record, and let's do sysuser, the sysuser table, and say if gr get, and I'm going to use gs get user ID, so my own user ID, and then say gs info gr, let's get manager name. I don't know if I have a manager in here, so we're going to see if this fails. Yeah, it's nothing in there. So let me go to my user record real quick and set a manager. And I am the sysadmin here. I got to get used to this new thing. Okay, admin here. Is manager not show? Let's go back and put it in our list then. How long did it take everyone to find that gear?
Longer than I'd like to admit.
Big Tasty pointed it out early on, so.
Oh, nice. Okay, so Abel's my manager now. Let me come back here and we call what we called before. Let's see. If gr get, is this right? Oh, gs get user ID, gs info, gr manager name. What am I missing? Anyone see what I'm missing? Oh, I didn't set it on the right admin. It needs to be here. That'll do it. We would have all been thinking about that one forever. So let's try manager name again. Right, able tutor, right? So I call this out as a bad practice because when we do that, sorry, everything's going haywire on me. When we do that, we actually, it goes in and actually pulls the whole user record for able tutor rather than just pulling that one value, okay? So dot walking in a return value is really convenient a lot of times, but if you're doing it a lot and you're doing it a lot in one script, it's likely gonna affect performance because every time it dot walks to a new level, it goes out and grabs the whole object. When if we just said gr get display value, right, on manager, at this point, it's going out and it's only returning that one value instead of the entire object. So in this instance, obviously it's not a huge deal, but a bunch of things added onto each other, you know, dot walking can really bog it down. Okay. So avoid it if you can. If not, if dot walking cannot be avoided, again, use toString function. Oh, and that's saying, so let's say you have to dot walk to manager again. What I'm saying here is that if I dot walk to manager name, or let's say it wasn't a string value that I was dot walking to, I can't call get, you may be able to call get value on this. I'm not sure how that works. I think it would fail, but to string will definitely, as long as that manager exists, and again, you can do some code to check that, but as long as that manager exists, calling to string on it rather than a get value or a get display value is what you would do there. That's why that's called out. I thank everyone for your time. Hopefully this was enjoyable and you learned something. Thanks, everyone.